What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king. In today's episode, I do decree that game streaming as a concept needs to die in a fire, and I truly do mean without exception. I have never been a fan of the concept of streaming, even with Sony's PlayStation Now service where you're technically not buying games but rather just renting games through streaming. I've never been a fan of it. There are just way too many obstacles in the way of streaming that are borderline impossible to overcome, as well as so many things that just make streaming the most anti-consumer thing that the game industry has ever tried to pull. And yes, I do understand that there are some nice, highly touted benefits to streaming that I'm sure people out there would like to take advantage of. And I do think that there are a couple of ways that this could work differently that can circumvent it that I'll talk about towards the end. But by and large, I don't want game streaming to work at all because of the fine line that it toes, the fine dangerous line that it toes in regards to the balance between company control and consumer control. And I'll get into that in a minute as well. But let's start by talking about the comparison that a lot of people make and especially companies like to make between game streaming services and movie and music streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify. And those just do not correlate in any way, shape, or form, in my opinion. I really think that it is reckless to consider game streaming the same as something like Netflix and Spotify. First of all, video games are just flat out more expensive and more involved than movies or television or music ever will be. What is usually the base cost for a movie when it comes out on Blu-ray? $20, $30 sometimes when you get it in 4K. What about a television season? Maybe $60, but that's an entire season, okay? How much is an album? $10, okay? Video games, they're always $60. They are more expensive experiences, both in terms of how much they cost to buy and in terms of how much they cost to make. Yes, absolutely, movie budgets are oftentimes more expensive than video game budgets, but you have to remember that movies don't rely solely on retail to make their money. They make their money in theaters, obviously. Retail is a very secondary thing. But in terms of the physical ownership space, video games are at a much higher value than any of those things, and therefore, it is, in my opinion, much more dangerous to play the game of whether or not we should have full access and full rights to a video game than we should with movie and music. Another reason being that Hollywood and the music industry really don't have that much of an archival problem, while the video game industry has a massive archival problem, as we've even seen in recent years with recent video games such as the likes of Silent Hills or Deadpool or any other number of games that have any licenses tied to them, because when those licenses expire, the publisher no longer has the right to make any money off of that. Thing is, though, with movies and music, they don't have those sorts of problems. They're allowed to continue selling regardless of any of those issues because licenses are permanent in terms of music and movies. Even if those rights do expire or are then transferred, someone out there is always able to make money off of a song or a movie or a television show, while with video games, publishing rights are a one-and-done deal. Once a publisher loses their hold on a game, there is so much utter disregard for video games as a product that it's just gone forever. And almost always the only way you can possibly hope to recover that game is through the means of piracy. So trying to in any way compare the concept of streaming games to the concept of streaming movies or music is, in my opinion, a false equivalency. Now let's talk about Xbox Game Pass for a second, because I know a lot of people like to compare, or mostly companies like to try to compare their streaming services or upcoming streaming services to the likes of Xbox Game Pass. First of all, Game Pass, at least as of right now, isn't a streaming service. It is a download and play service. It also advertises itself very differently, which is one thing that helps it, but it also just works in a way where the value can actually be equated to something along the lines of Netflix, where you are not necessarily expecting to own something permanently. On top of that, with Game Pass come deals where you can actually buy the games that you have on Game Pass at discounts, further incentivizing you to, if you want to own the game, then go out and pay for it. And guess what? At that point, it is yours. You do own it. It's not locked on a server somewhere. It's not up in the cloud somewhere. It's on your hard drive, and therefore you are able to play it under any circumstances. Game Pass is also very affordable. We're talking $10 a month or $15 if you want to do the ultimate Game Pass that comes with Xbox Live Gold. And that's it. That's all that you're paying to have access to a huge library of, I want to say almost 300 games at this point. Just a crap ton of video games at your disposal. Nobody in their right mind is going to expect that with a fee like that they should have rights to own all of those games. No, there's a much better value proposition there where you feel like, yes, I am renting these for as long as I am paying for the service. And again, it's not a streaming service. You are downloading these to your hard drive that you can then play off of the hard drive without having to worry about infrastructure. And now we're going to talk about that next, because internet infrastructure is bad for most people. It is not a universal thing. I don't care if you are in a nice place where fiber is set up for everybody. That is not how it is across the world, and therefore streaming it's not going to happen for most people. Even if the streaming infrastructure itself improves where less is required of you, the problem is internet companies. They kind of suck. They are notorious for throttling internet speeds almost everywhere in almost every single country that even has access to internet. Internet companies are some of the most monopolistic companies around, and until that changes, which it probably never will unless completely different enterprises actually take over the internet business itself, there's no way of getting around that hurdle. It's just impossible. And so to then be expected to rely on both your ISP as well as the servers of the company that is hosting the streaming service is just absurd, and it's not going to work. Let's talk about that for a minute. The companies that are hosting these streaming services. So obviously the big one right now is Google Stadia. I'm just going to say what probably most of you are thinking. Google sucks. It is a terrible company. It is a notoriously terrible company. It also has a very dodgy track record, and it owns YouTube, the worst website on the entire internet that tens of thousands of people's livelihoods depend on. So to say that I don't trust Google as far as I can throw them to handle a service that's going to completely operate on consumer trust and dependency is putting it very, very mildly. And let's not even start on all of the other companies that are looking into making streaming services a thing. Even Microsoft, who I did just praise a few minutes ago when talking about Xbox Game Pass, also has a very bad track record, lest we forget the launch of the Xbox One and how that was supposed to go down before overwhelming consumer backlash forced Microsoft's hand, and they did eventually cave in to peer pressure. But overwhelmingly, the biggest issue for me above everything else is the death of ownership. I'm not a propagandist or some doomsday preacher. I'm just a realist. I do not trust the cloud, at least not solely. Any person with a brain knows that if you ever back up things to the cloud for ease of access, you are always, as long as those things are important to you, as long as those things cost money, supposed to create separate backups on physical hard drives that you yourself own. You can never, ever fully and overwhelmingly just trust the cloud. Don't even get me started on the numerous instances we've had in just the last few years where people who have solely put their faith in cloud servers, in the servers that another company that is not them owns, have backfired on them. Facebook privacy concerns, anyone? But that's just the thing, right? It's not even the fact that we are solely putting these trusts on these very dodgy companies. It's the fact that this is clearly a way of getting people used to the fact that they don't own the games that they're paying for, that they own a license, that they have the right of access to these video games rather than owning them themselves. And you know what? Screw that. Absolutely screw that. That is bullshit. Video games are expensive, and companies have already spent the last several years trying to do everything in their power to nickel and dime us for everything, with some of the worst incentivization in the world and some of the most underhanded, sleazy tactics that they can possibly think of. And the fact that anyone will try to suggest that after all of the games we've bought, after all of the special editions, after all of the microtransactions, after all of the pre-order incentives, after the many attempts to kill off the used games market, that we should then not even own these things we are paying hundreds of dollars for is certainly laughable at first, but it quickly becomes immensely infuriating when you think about it for just a little longer. Fuck that. I, as a consumer, should always be able to exercise my right to own the things that I pay for. Now, I do want to quickly address the fact that, yes, there are some pros to game streaming that people like to point to. And I'm going to be honest, I don't find very many of them all that compelling. The only one that I think makes a reasonable argument is the being able to stream anywhere on any device argument. The fact that you are able to play console games thanks to the cloud on a mobile phone, no matter where you're at, if you're like at the airport, for instance. And while that is definitely nice, I would much rather have those kinds of incentives in the form of a device like the PlayStation Vita or the Nintendo Switch, where I have full ownership of the data on the console itself. I think one way that this could be circumvented if this was offered, but no company is ever going to offer this. Although I will say that Sony at least tried. They have definitely tried, and I will give them kudos to this, even though they've never really followed through with it. But it kind of piggybacks on that idea. And that is, I guess, what would you call it? Local network streaming. Essentially, what the idea behind it is and they still kind of have an app for this, is if your PlayStation 4 is connected to a Wi-Fi network and then your device is connected to a Wi-Fi network, you can use that device as a second screen. Now, obviously, this allows you to access things from your device, not some server that some other company owns, your device. If we can expound upon that idea and then again, try to basically use our own networks to then stream the stuff that we own, I don't have a problem with that. But that is not a streaming service in general. That is just streaming technology. And that I'm in full support of. I think that's a cool idea. But we're not really moving in that direction, are we? No, that's not the point of Google Stadia. That's not the point of whatever Microsoft's got going on. That's not the point of what EA and Ubisoft want. They want control of your library. They want you to pay them, and then your money goes out into the ether, and what you get in return is a full-fledged video game, but it's got a leash attached to it, and that leash can get yanked away at any time, and there's really nothing you can do about it because of the terms and conditions that have been set by the publisher. And I'm just not okay with that in any shape or form. I do not want streaming to catch on. I hope that this thing dies. I hope that because of all of the infrastructural issues, this proves not to be lucrative and Google just abandons it, that Microsoft just abandons it. I don't want streaming to catch on. I don't think it even can, but even in the big cities where this is more likely to actually, technically function and work, I still don't want this to catch on. I don't care how, quote unquote, convenient it might be. Video games should not exist in the same space as movies and music. They're just not the same thing, and I really wish that we would stop trying to compare them. It just doesn't work that way. And I'm sorry, but no amount of intrigue, no amount of convenience, no amount of, well, this might be actually kind of cool, will ever, in my opinion, trump my rights as a consumer.